side note, as I was finishing writing up the message this morning, I was playing the song King of My Heart and singing it because I like it. But I was thinking, we haven't done that song in ages. Wow, I'd like to do that song. I had no idea that's what you'd picked. So that's really cool. This morning, I've given the title to the message, Waiting Through the Wilderness. And if the picture comes up, you'll see the way I've spelled that because, you could take that any way that you want to. Actually, I sent the title to Curtis so he could make that, and he sends back, do you mean waiting or waiting? And I thought, I send it to you exactly the way I want it. I meant waiting. I believe that God is moving quite significantly through the church at the moment, through individuals, through us, through the global church. And something that has been sitting with me a little bit is that there are a lot of people who are in the process between a revelation and a breakthrough, or promise given and the promise received. Some people, you've only just received that seed into your heart and you're still waiting for it to sprout and to bear fruit. Others, you might have an inkling that you're nearly there, but you might have no idea. God sometimes likes to spring it on you. Some other people, you're actually in the middle, and it's a long time coming. I want to talk about this middle place in between having received the word from God or the revelation, the promise, whatever slant it feels like to you, and actually receiving that. This place in the middle, be honest, it's really not that fun. It's not comfortable. It can feel incredibly dry and rocky. But it's actually the place and the path that God's laid out for us, because it's in those places that we build the history with God along the journey. And it's a bit like, I call it the faith gym. And don't laugh because I'm not good at this. It's a bit like the faith gym. It prepares you for the breakthrough and the destiny that God has for your life. And something we really need to remember is that this middle place, the wilderness, is actually not a spiritual attack, any more than the pain that you feel from exercising means that you've been sprung upon and beaten up. It hurts because it's a stretch. But it's not a spiritual attack. And God is the God of all comfort when we need him, but he's not the God of making us comfortable. So he loves you and he cares for you, and he's never going to leave your side. But it's those times of slogging through the sand and the grit of life that is going to give you the choice to either give up there or to lean into the strength and the word that God gave you and to keep pressing on towards what he's called you to live. So I'm going to talk mainly, we're going to jump through a few scriptures this morning because the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt and getting to the promised land kind of covers an entire 5 books of the Bible, which I'm not going to read the entire lot. We'd be here for a very long time. But I'm going to start in Exodus chapter 13. And this is the start of the journey. As I said, there are people that are just at the start of the journey. So Exodus 13. So the people of Israel have been in slavery for 430 years in Egypt. Moses was raised in the palace. He runs away to escape punishment. God meets him after 40 years and says, I've chosen you to go and set the people free. So Moses goes back. There's a big showdown between God and Pharaoh, and obviously God wins. Pharaoh finally let the people go. So picking up verse 17. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the Promised Land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness towards the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. God purposefully did not lead the Israelites straight to the promise. But the Israelites thought that's the way they were going to go. Because they came up out of Egypt ready for battle. They thought, that's it, we're heading straight there. We've got this. And God's just looking at them going, yeah, no. Because he knew the limitations of their strength at this point. They were ready to fight for their new land, but God led them in the opposite direction, straight through the desert. And things may not look the way that you're expecting to look. You get a word from God and you it's our automatic assumption that we've got a word from God and it's just going to play out the way that we think we expect it to happen straight away. And it's not the way it works. They weren't ready for a battle. And we know this because just a few verses later, they reach the Red Sea, the Egyptians turn around, chase them down, and the Israelites go into panic mode. There was no way they were ready for a battle, even against an army that had already been decimated by the 10 plagues in Egypt. When you decide to trust in the direction and the leading of God, your faith starts getting just a little bit stronger. And it only takes the faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain. But it's when you decide when and where you decide to exercise that faith that determines how strong it is. Because there's absolutely no point in having the strongest faith if you're not going to use it. So this is what this is. You're weighing up your faith and you're deciding when you're going to use it. So they get to the Red Sea, and God at this point is actually leading them in a visible form. Daytime it was a pillar of cloud, nighttime it was a pillar of fire, which must have been so much relief in both day and night. Daytime they would have been shaded. Nighttime there was light and there was warmth, as the desert is kind of extreme. So they get to the Red Sea. The Egyptians start chasing them. They go into panic mode, and Moses has a little bit of a panic attack himself, and God says, it's okay, just be still. He doesn't expect them to fight yet, just be still. And watch this. So he leads them up to the Red Sea. Moses strikes the water with his staff. The cloud, which has been leading them, moves behind them and blocks the way between the Israelites and the Egyptians. It becomes stormy and dark on the Egyptian side. The sea splits open, walls of water on either side, dry land. The Israelites walk through. The cloud goes to the other side. The Egyptians try to follow. They get partway across and their chariot wheels fall off. And they're in a panic in the middle of the sea and the water comes crashing down on top of them. And that's the end of the Egyptians. All of the army that was there at any rate. Funny, a few years ago, they discovered that there's horse and human skeletons and chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea. I wonder how they got there. This isn't just a collection of feel-good stories. This is history. It happens. And that's how the chariot wheels got on the bottom of the Red Sea. So that's the start of your journey. Trust and wait. Be still. Don't push your limitations. God knows what your limitations are. And He's willing to fight for you, but you need to trust Him. All right, we've got the middle of the journey. First one, I actually called, and I forgot to mention this, I called it the wilderness of grace because you have absolutely no idea what God is protecting you from by taking you the other way. The middle of the journey, the wilderness of training, still part of God's plan. We're looking at Exodus 15, 22 to 25. Moses led Israel from the Red Sea and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they travelled into the desert without finding water, which in the desert is a bit of a problem. They came to Marah and they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Now, this was the perfect opportunity for the people to put into practice the faith that they had strengthened at the Red Sea. God had already parted the sea. You'd think He would be able to provide drinking water for His people who needed it. But this obviously didn't occur to the Israelites. And once again, we've panicked. But God provides their needs. God gives us opportunities to lean into Him. But He is also merciful and He meets us where we're at. God also showed the Israelites incredible mercy and grace after that little incident, because they travelled a little bit further into the desert, and they arrived at an oasis, and they set up camp there, which is where God must have been leading them, because the cloud would stop where God wanted them to stop. So He gave them time to become refreshed. But it was only a camp. They still lived in tents. They were still pitched at the oasis, and when the cloud moved on, they had to keep moving because their oasis wasn't going to sustain them. It wasn't the promised land. And the encouragement and the refreshing that God gives you along the journey is not going to sustain you for the rest of the journey. Jesus said to the Samaritan woman at the well that if she had asked Him, He would have given her living water. And they called it living water because living water moved. It was always fresh and it didn't have time to sit there and get stale. We need to be constantly moving forward and drinking from the source of the living water, because that is what's going to sustain us through the journey to get to the promise that God has given us. moving just to the next part of the story, Exodus 16, from verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim, which was the oasis, and came to the desert of Sin, which is the original language not referring to our English word sin, on the 15th day of the second month after they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Oh, so dramatic. I think they're forgetting that they were actually slaves in Egypt. It's so easy to forget what wasn't part of God's plan back where we were. They had the opportunity to weigh up their faith a little bit more, build their faith a little bit more. They didn't do it. And they said, it would have been better if God to just kill us where we were. The people still had the mindsets of slaves. They expected, in Egypt, they were owned by the Egyptians, and so everything they had came from the Egyptians. And I suppose, in a way, they expected God to just dish everything up to them because that's the mindset of a slave. They don't realise that they became children of God that inherit these things as they trust in God. And they didn't really understand the attributes of God because they hadn't yet built the history and the testimony of knowing who God was. Revelation chapter 19:10. It tells us that the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. In other words, it's saying that the act of speaking out and testifying what God has done for us in the past strengthens our faith and the faith of those around us with the prophetic reassurance that God is able to do it again. But this is also a journey of building the faith. It's like Peter when he first met Jesus. First time he met Jesus, he didn't jump out of the boat and run across the water. First time he met Jesus, he'd been out fishing all night and he hadn't caught a thing. And Jesus said, "Put your net on the other side." And he drew in a catch that nearly sunk 2 boats. A little bit later, they're all out in the boat and the storm comes up and they're scared. What's going to happen? Jesus, we're going to drown. No, we're not. Jesus said we're getting to the other side. Just like he told the Israelites, "I'm going to lead you to the land that I've promised you. You're not dying in the desert. We're getting to the other side." And he calmed the storm. So that by the time Peter is in the boat without Jesus and Jesus comes out towards him on top of the waves and he tells Peter to come, Peter knows this is Jesus who controls the water. I've seen him bring fish for my livelihood. He's provided for me. He's calmed the storm. He's calmed my worries. I can do this because I know who Jesus is. And the Israelites didn't do that. By this point, God has already provided water for them. and they're worried about starving. But once again, God is so merciful to them, and he sends them manna from heaven every single day for the next 40 years without fail. He also, on that occasion, sent a whole massive flock of quail into the camp to feed all the people for a month. And so they were able to eat and be satisfied. A little bit further down the track, again, there's no water. Again, they forget what God has already done for them. And again, they complain. Are you going to kill us in the wilderness? No, because we're getting to the other side. So, let's bring water out of a rock. It's not going to look like what you expect, but God is going to refresh you and satisfy you every step along the way. But I do wonder, what would God have done if they hadn't complained in the first place? A little bit later, again, no water. Again, we complain. Again, God brings water out of the rock. Then there's the other end of the journey. And I've called this little section Destiny or Disappointment. So we're going to skip quite a bit now and get into Numbers 13. Actually, no, sorry, Numbers 14. So they come through the desert. They meet with God on Mount Sinai and they have an encounter with God. And then they keep moving forward and they reach the border of their promised land and they send in the spies to the land and they go check out the land, scout it out. They come back and most of the spies say, no, sorry, I am in Numbers 13. I thought that was right. They spread the bad report about the land among the Israelites. I'm in verse 32. The land we travelled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. Now skipping to 14, verse 6. The two of the men who had explored the land, Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of, I'm not quite sure what, they tore their clothing. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we travelled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land, flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. It says in Hebrews that it's impossible to please God without faith. They're saying if God is pleased with us, we have to have faith. We have to have faith. We've been building this faith all the way along the journey. Now's the time to use it. Now's the time to believe for the breakthrough, for the promise that God has given us. Caleb and Joshua knew that there was nothing that could stand in the way of what God had promised them. And they say that it's always darkest before the dawn. It's at the end of the wilderness that the journey will seem most unbearable and most unworthwhile. The giants will seem bigger, and your promise and destiny will seem the most unachievable at this point, but this is the moment that you've been trained for. And the promised land, it might not look what you were like what you were expecting. But it's the time to not get bewildered. And I've used that word deliberately because we define it as confusion, but the root of the word actually means to thoroughly lead back into the wilderness, back into the forgotten places. Don't get bewildered. The Israelites allowed themselves to become bewildered, and they rebelled against God, complained against him, and their lack of faith meant that they ended up being left in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And that generation did not see the realization of the promise that they'd been given back in Egypt. So we have the choice. Are we going to reach our destiny and the promise and turn back because it looks too hard? Or are we going to pick up and strengthen and exercise the faith that we've been building along the way? Because I know it looks hard and it might not look like what we were expecting. But we know that God has gone before us. He's provided for us. He's sheltered us and he's comforted us and he's never left our side. He's not going to fail us. So we're going to trust him and obey his word, because that promise is ours. And the word that God gave you right back at the start is as true now as it was then. So don't get turned back into the wilderness of disappointment, because God has not intended to strand you in the wilderness. And even in there, if you choose to go back, God's never going to leave you. But the delay on your promise is only going to, you're the one that's going to pay for that. But God's grace is still there. God's grace is still going to bring you through that. Finally, look up on the screen for Matthew 4. This is where we navigate our way through the wilderness. At this point, Jesus has just been baptized. And it says in verse 1, afterward, the Holy Spirit led Jesus into the lonely wilderness. Once again, not an attack. The Spirit led him there in order to reveal his strength against the accuser by going through the ordeal of testing. And after fasting for 40 days, Jesus was extremely weak and famished. Just the understatement of the Gospels right there. Then the tempter came to entice him to provide food by doing a miracle. So he said to Jesus, "How could you possibly be the Son of God and go hungry? Just order these stones to be turned into loaves of bread." He answered, "The scriptures say, bread alone will not satisfy, but true life is found in every word which constantly goes forth from God's mouth." First thing to navigating the wilderness is know who you are. And we can get so hung up about this. It's really one of the easiest ploys the enemy has. I was thinking about it. Someone was trying to intimidate me, and they came up to me and said, "Are you really Bruce and Linda's daughter?" I'd kind of look at them and go, "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, it's what my birth certificate says." And the older that I get, the more characteristics I see coming out of me that I've inherited from them. That person could keep nagging me and nagging me and nagging me about whether that's my true identity. I've got nothing to prove. I know who I am. And we don't need to get worried. Know who you are. Be peaceful in that. and keep moving. Verse 5, then the accuser transported Jesus to the holy city of Jerusalem and perched him at the highest point of the temple and said to him, if you're really God's son, once again identity, jump and the angels will catch you, for it's written in the scriptures, he will command his angels to protect you and they will lift you up so that you won't even bruise your foot on a rock. And once again, Jesus said to him, the scriptures say, you must never put the Lord your God to a test. That's the second point to navigating the wilderness. Know who's with you. You're not on your own. The wilderness feels lonely, but you're never on your own. And knowing who's with you comes from knowing who you are in God. If you know who you are in God, you know that God is with you. And verse 8. The third time the accuser lifted Jesus onto a very high mountain range and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all the splendour that goes with it. All of these kingdoms I will give to you, the accuser said, if only you will kneel down before me and worship me. But Jesus said, go away, enemy, for the scriptures say, kneel before the Lord your God and worship only him. And that's the third point to navigating the wilderness is know who you worship. We know who we are in God. We know that God is with us. When we worship him, we're lifting our eyes away from the dirt and the sand that wants to drag us down. And we're fixing our eyes up on his face. And we can see, we might not see the whole picture, but we can see the next step that we're taking. Because when we worship him, he leads us. And he guides us. Whether you're at the start, right at the start of that journey, or you're in the middle, or maybe you're at the end and maybe you don't realise that you're towards the end of actually breaking through to that promise. That journey, as I said, it's never easy. But when we know who we are, we know who's with us, and we know who we worship, this is where we find the grace along the journey. And we know where to go to be sustained. And just like Jesus in the wilderness, we can stand against the attacks, because the wilderness will make you vulnerable, but we can stand against the attacks. Can you all stand, please? The first night that God started just speaking to me a bit about this wilderness season was actually the night at the big concert up in Tamworth, the Haymate concert to support the farmers. And I just felt like I was saying there's a lot of drought in Australia at the moment, but there's a lot of people who feel like they're in drought within themselves as well. So if you close your eyes, I just want to pray for you. And I'm not going to ask you to come forward or put your hand up or anything, but if you know that that's you, then just place your heart out, because we're going to ask for God to just meet with you and refresh you, to give you the strength and the reassurance for the next step in your journey. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you are the living water. I thank you that you never leave us and you never forsake us. You are our provider and you're our comforter. And God, I pray for every person who feels like they are in drought within themselves, God. I pray that, Holy Spirit, you would come and you would refresh every heart that is yearning to be refreshed, every heart that needs to be sustained for the next step and the step after that. And God, whatever point in the journey that every single person is on, I thank you that you have given us a word and that you are faithful and that you complete what you've started. God, thank you that you are so good to us. Amen.